"You better start acting like part of this family, or I swear to God." The words came out of Richard's mouth in a spray of coffee-tinged breath. His face so close to mine, I could see the burst capillaries in his cheeks, the ones that came from years of weekend drinking he thought nobody noticed. We were standing in the hallway of St. Catherine's Hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with that particular frequency that makes everything feel both too bright and somehow underwater. And my mother was 3 doors down, fighting for her life, after a sudden brain aneurysm, and Richard was yelling at me about not showing up fast enough, not looking concerned enough, not being the daughter he thought I should be, despite never treating me like one for a single day of the 17 years he'd been married to my mother. I'd driven 4 hours straight from Portland the moment I got the call, hadn't stopped even for coffee, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole way, because whatever Richard had put me through over the years, she was still my mother, and the thought of losing her made my chest feel like it was caving in on itself. But I'd walked into that hospital at 11:47 p.m., exhausted and terrified, and the first words out of Richard's mouth weren't about Mom's condition or which doctor I should talk to, but about how I'd taken too long to get there, how Amanda, his precious daughter, my stepsister, had been there within an hour, how Amanda was in the room holding Mom's hand right now while I was just showing up. "I left the second you called," I said, trying to keep my voice level, trying not to let him see how his words were landing like they always did, in that soft place between my ribs where I'd been collecting his dismissals and his disappointments for most of my life. "There was an accident on I-5, the traffic was—" He cut me off with a sharp gesture, his hand slicing through the air between us. "There's always an excuse with you, isn't there? Always some reason why you can't be bothered to show up for this family." 2 nurses walked past us, their shoes squeaking on the linoleum, their eyes cutting toward us with that particular look healthcare workers get when they're witnessing a family falling apart in their hallway, when they're deciding whether they need to intervene. I felt my face getting hot, that familiar shame washing over me, the one that came from being called out, being found lacking, being told in 100 different ways that I wasn't enough and never would be. "I am here," I said quietly. "I came as fast as I could." That's when his hand came up. That's when everything I'd buried for 17 years, every slight and every dismissal and every time I'd smiled through the pain of being treated like I didn't matter, came rushing to the surface in the half-second before his palm connected with my cheek. The sound echoed in that hospital hallway like a gunshot. The slap in that hospital hallway wasn't the beginning, though it was certainly the end of something, and standing there with my cheek burning and my eyes watering from the shock and the pain, I found myself thinking about the first time I'd met Richard Morrison, back when I was 14 years old, and still believed that family meant people who loved you unconditionally, who showed up for you the way my father had before the car accident took him from us when I was 12. Mom had been alone for 2 years, struggling to make ends meet on her administrative assistant salary, and I'd watched her carry the weight of bills and grief and single parenthood with a kind of quiet desperation that made me ache for her, made me want to be perfect and easy and no trouble at all. So when she started dating Richard, when she came home from that first date with an actual smile on her face for the first time in what felt like forever, I decided I would love him because she needed me to, because she deserved happiness, and I wasn't going to be the difficult teenager who stood in the way of it. Richard worked in commercial real estate, drove a nice car, wore expensive watches, and came to dinner at our small rental house with flowers for Mom and a gift card to Barnes& Noble for me. And I thought maybe this was what saved looked like. Maybe this man with his confident handshake and his talk about finally giving Mom the life she deserved would be the answer to all the fear I'd been carrying about whether we'd be okay. He had a daughter too, Amanda, who was 16 and lived with him full-time after his divorce. And at that first awkward family dinner where our 2 broken families sat around the table at Olive Garden trying to figure out how to fit together, Amanda had looked at me with the kind of cool assessment that only teenage girls can manage, taking in my clearance rack outfit and my nervousness. and I could see her calculating exactly where I fell in whatever hierarchy she'd already constructed in her mind. They got married 8 months later in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Salem, and we moved into Richard's four-bedroom house in the nice part of town where the lawns were always perfectly maintained and everyone had new cars in their driveways. And for about 3 weeks, I let myself believe that we were going to be one of those blended families you see in sitcoms, the kind where everyone learns to love each other and past pain gets healed through patience and understanding. But Richard had rules about his house, about how things were done, about what he expected from the people living under his roof, and it became clear very quickly that those expectations looked different depending on whether you were his daughter or just the daughter of the woman he'd married. Amanda got a brand new silver Honda Accord for her 18th birthday, delivered to the driveway with a giant red bow on the hood, while the whole family stood outside clapping, and Richard had his arm around her shoulders telling her she deserved it for working so hard in school. Never mind that she'd barely maintained a 2.8 GPA and had failed 2 classes her junior year. When I turned 18 4 months later, I got a card with $50 in it, and a lecture about fiscal responsibility, about how I needed to learn the value of money and not expect handouts, about how building character meant working for the things you wanted instead of having them handed to you. And I'd smiled and thanked him because that's what I'd learned to do by then, to accept whatever scraps of acknowledgement came my way, and be grateful I got even that much. College applications rolled around, and Amanda decided she wanted to go to University of Oregon, a decent state school where the annual cost with room and board came out to about $28,000, and Richard wrote those checks without blinking, set her up in a nice apartment near campus her sophomore year when she decided dorm life wasn't for her, gave her a monthly allowance of $800 for expenses. I'd gotten into Oregon State with a partial academic scholarship that would cover about 60% of tuition, and when I'd brought the acceptance letter to Richard, hoping maybe he'd help with the remaining costs, he'd looked at the papers for maybe 30 seconds before telling me that if I wanted to go to college, I'd need to figure out how to pay for it myself, that he'd already done his part by providing me a home through high school, that his financial obligations were to his own daughter, and I needed to understand that there was only so much to go around. I'd worked 3 jobs that first year, waitressing at a diner near campus, stocking shelves at Target overnight, doing administrative work for one of my professors, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, and maintaining a 3.7 GPA because I was determined to prove that I could do it, that I was worth something even if Richard didn't think so. Amanda graduated in 5 years with a degree in communications and no job prospects, moved back home where Richard converted the basement into an apartment for her rent-free. And when she finally did get a job as a receptionist at a dental office making $32,000 a year, the family acted like she'd just been appointed CEO of a Fortune 500 company, threw her a celebration dinner at the nicest steakhouse in town, where Richard gave a toast about how proud he was of her ambition and drive. I graduated in 4 years with honors and a double major in marketing and business administration, had already accepted a position at a mid-sized tech company in Portland, starting at $58,000, and when I'd told the family at Sunday dinner, Richard had nodded once and said something about how I'd always been obsessed with proving myself, and then the conversation had moved on to Amanda's new boyfriend, and whether he was serious enough to meet the extended family at Thanksgiving. The financial inequality continued and crystallized over the next several years in ways that became impossible to ignore, though I still tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was building my own life and didn't need their support anyway. Amanda got engaged to Trevor when she was 26, a guy she'd been dating for 18 months who worked in sales and seemed nice enough in that bland, inoffensive way some people have, and Richard immediately offered to pay for the entire wedding, telling Amanda that every girl deserved her dream wedding and that she should spare no expense because this was her special day and he wanted it to be perfect. They spent $45,000 on that wedding, a fact I knew because Amanda couldn't stop talking about the budget, about how generous her dad was being, about the designer dress that cost $6,000 alone, and the destination bachelorette party in Cabo that Richard also funded to the tune of another $4,000 for Amanda's share. The wedding was at a vineyard in wine country, with 200 guests and a live band and a 7-course dinner. And I'd been a bridesmaid, which meant I'd paid for my own dress and travel and hotel and thrown money into the various showers and parties, probably spending close to $2,000 total to participate in Amanda's celebration of a love I wasn't entirely sure would last past the honeymoon period. When I'd gotten engaged to Marcus 2 years later, a kind and steady software engineer I'd met through work who treated me like I actually mattered, who listened when I talked and remembered the things I cared about. I'd gone to Sunday dinner with my ring on my finger and my heart cautiously hopeful that maybe this milestone would finally be the thing that made Richard see me as worth celebrating. Richard had glanced at the ring, said congratulations in the same tone you'd use to acknowledge someone's comment about the weather, and then asked Amanda about her and Trevor's plans to buy a house, a purchase he was helping them with by providing $30,000 for a down payment. Mom had hugged me and said she was happy for me, but there was no offer of financial help, no questions about what kind of wedding I wanted, no suggestion that they'd contribute anything at all to the celebration, and I'd felt something hard and bitter settle in my chest as I realized that even this, even my wedding, would be something I'd have to do alone. Marcus and I paid for our own wedding, a small ceremony at a botanical garden with 60 guests, and a reception at a nice restaurant that came to about $8,000 total. And it was beautiful in its simplicity, intimate and genuine. But I couldn't help comparing it to the extravagant spectacle Richard had funded for Amanda, couldn't stop the voice in my head that said this was proof of exactly how little I mattered to them. The pattern continued with everything. Richard bought Amanda and Trevor a new SUV when their old car died, something practical for the family they were planning. A $38,000 vehicle he purchased outright, while when my 10-year-old sedan finally gave out, I'd gotten a lecture about the importance of staying within my means and buying used. Amanda got $5,000 when she and Trevor needed help with credit card debt from their overspending, got another $3,000 for new furniture when they didn't like what they had, got regular infusions of cash for various emergencies that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency, while the one time I'd asked Richard if he could loan me $1,500 when Marcus was between jobs and we were struggling with rent, he'd told me that I needed to learn to budget better and that handouts didn't help people develop financial responsibility. I stopped telling them about the promotions after a while, stopped mentioning the raises or the new opportunities that kept coming my way, because I'd learned that sharing good news with people who didn't want to celebrate you only compounded the hurt of their indifference. When I made senior marketing manager at 29 with a salary jump to $78,000, I'd mentioned it at Sunday dinner, and Richard had looked up from his plate long enough to say something about how corporate ladder climbing was all well and good, but real fulfillment came from family and community, and then he'd turned to Amanda to ask about her plans for redecorating her living room, a project he'd offered to fund to the tune of $5,000. I got promoted to marketing director at 32, managing a team of 12 people and overseeing a budget of $2.3 million annually. And I didn't tell them at all. Just let them continue thinking I was doing whatever vague office work they'd never bothered to understand or ask about. And there was something quietly satisfying about having this whole other life they knew nothing about. This professional identity, where people respected my opinions and valued my contributions and sought out my expertise. Marcus and I moved to Seattle when I was 33 for an opportunity at a larger tech company where they'd offered me a director-level position starting at $115,000 plus equity. And when I told my family we were relocating, Richard had said something about how some people were never satisfied staying in one place, always chasing the next thing instead of building roots, and Mom had cried like I was moving to another planet instead of 3 hours north. The distance was a relief in ways I hadn't expected, the physical space making it easier to create emotional boundaries, making the Sunday dinners optional instead of obligatory. And I found myself declining more invitations than I accepted, claiming work projects and travel schedules, building a life in Seattle that felt entirely mine in a way nothing had felt before. I was good at my job, really. Good. The kind of good that got noticed by leadership and resulted in increasing responsibility and recognition. And by 35, I was Senior Director of Marketing with a salary of $142,000 and a reputation in the industry as someone who could turn around struggling campaigns and build brands from the ground up. I won awards, got invited to speak at conferences, had articles published in marketing journals, built a professional network of people who knew my worth without needing to be convinced of it. And none of my family attended a single event or read a single article or acknowledged any of it because I'd stopped telling them and they'd never bothered to ask. The silence around my achievements became its own kind of communication, a clear message that who I was and what I accomplished would never matter to them the way Amanda's most mundane activities seemed to, and instead of fighting it, I started to lean into it, to find freedom in their indifference, to build my success in the quiet spaces they'd never thought to look. The hardest part wasn't Richard's cruelty or Amanda's smugness, or even the stark financial inequality that had defined my adult life, but rather my mother's silence, her passive acceptance of the differential treatment, the way she stood by and watched it happen year after year without ever stepping in to say that it wasn't right or fair or acceptable. I'd tried talking to her about it privately more times than I could count, conversations that started hopefully and ended with me feeling gaslit and guilty for even bringing it up. Like I was the problem for noticing the obvious disparity in how Richard treated his biological daughter versus his stepdaughter. When I was 24 and working 2 jobs to pay off student loans while Amanda was getting her credit card bills paid by Richard, I'd sat with Mom in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon when Richard was at work and Amanda was out, and I'd asked her directly why she let him treat us so differently, why she didn't say anything when he funded Amanda's entire life while I struggled alone. Mom had looked uncomfortable, had busied herself wiping down counters that were already clean, and told me that Richard was just closer to Amanda because he'd raised her from birth, that it was natural for parents to have different relationships with different children, that I needed to understand his perspective and not take it personally. Not take it personally. As if watching your stepsister get everything handed to her while you got nothing was something that could be anything other than deeply, profoundly personal. I'd tried again when I was 27, after the wedding budget disparity had made the favoritism impossible to ignore, had asked Mom why she hadn't insisted that Richard contribute to my wedding the way he had for Amanda's. And she'd sighed and said that Richard had his own way of doing things, that he'd worked hard for his money and had the right to spend it how he saw fit, that I should be grateful for the things I did have instead of focusing on what I didn't. The word grateful had stuck in my throat like a stone, bitter and hard, because what exactly was I supposed to be grateful for? For being tolerated in their home? For being allowed to attend family dinners where I was consistently ignored and undervalued? I'd realized during that conversation that my mother had made her choice years ago, had decided that keeping Richard happy and maintaining her financial security was more important than defending her daughter or demanding equal treatment. And that realization had hurt worse than any of Richard's direct cruelty because at least his disdain was honest. Mom's enabling came wrapped in weak excuses and requests that I be understanding, that I not rock the boat, that I keep the peace by accepting less and expecting nothing. And over the years I'd watched her make herself smaller and quieter, had seen how she'd learned to redirect Richard's attention away from conflict, how she'd smooth things over and make excuses and pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. She was financially dependent on him in ways that made her complicity more understandable but no less painful, had given up her career when she married him to be a stay-at-home mother to Amanda, had no retirement savings of her own, and no real path to independence at her age. And I understood intellectually that leaving him would mean losing her home and her security and the comfortable life she'd built, but understanding didn't make it hurt less when she chose that security over defending me. I'd stopped trying to talk to her about it by the time I was 30, had accepted that she would never be the advocate I needed, would never stand up to Richard on my behalf, would never acknowledge that his treatment of me was wrong, and that acceptance had created a different kind of distance between us. A sadness that colored every interaction because I'd lost faith not just in Richard, but in her too. There were moments before the hospital when I'd almost walked away for good, specific incidents that had brought me right to the edge of cutting contact completely. Times when the mistreatment was so blatant and painful that even my desperate need for family connection couldn't justify staying. Christmas of 2019 was the worst. When I'd driven down from Seattle specifically for the family gathering at Richard and Mom's house, had taken 2 days off work and spent 6 hours on the road in winter weather, and when I'd arrived, I'd found the living room decorated with framed family photos that had been professionally taken 3 weeks earlier at a session I hadn't been invited to. They were everywhere. These beautiful portraits of Richard and Mom and Amanda and her husband Derek and their new baby, all matching outfits and coordinated colors and genuine smiles, displayed prominently on the mantel and the side tables and the walls, and when I'd asked Mom quietly when the photos had been taken, she'd looked uncomfortable and said that Amanda had organized it as a surprise gift, and it had been last minute, and they hadn't wanted to bother me since I was so far away and so busy with work. But Amanda had posted about the photo session on Facebook 2 weeks before it happened, had shared the appointment details, and asked for outfit advice, and I was still on her friends list then, so I'd seen the posts, had watched in real time as my family had planned and executed and received these portraits that had deliberately excluded me, and the knowledge that it wasn't an oversight but an intentional omission had made it hard to breathe. I'd stayed for dinner because leaving immediately would have caused a scene, and I was still, even then, trying not to rock the boat, but I'd left right after dessert, claiming I wasn't feeling well, and I'd cried the entire 6-hour drive back to Seattle. Then there was Amanda's 30th birthday party in March of 2020, right before the pandemic shut everything down, a lavish celebration at an expensive restaurant that Richard had rented out and paid for completely. And when I'd arrived, I discovered that Amanda had created a seating chart that placed me at a table in the back corner with people I didn't know. Distant friends of hers, who spent the whole dinner talking among themselves, while I sat there feeling like an afterthought. While the family table up front included not just Richard and Mom and Amanda and Derek, but also several of Amanda's close friends and Derek's siblings. And the message was clear that I ranked below even non-family members in terms of importance. Richard had given a long toast about what an amazing daughter Amanda was and how proud he was of everything she'd accomplished, talking about her work as an administrative assistant like she'd cured cancer, and he'd never once in my entire life given a toast about me or publicly acknowledged any of my actual significant accomplishments. I'd left that party early too, and I'd sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to decide if I was done, if this was finally enough to justify walking away. But I'd convinced myself that I was being too sensitive, that I should try harder, that family was supposed to be forever, even when they treated you like you were disposable. There was the time Richard had criticized my career in front of extended family at a 4th of July barbecue, had said something about how corporate jobs were soulless, and people who chased money instead of meaning were missing the point of life. This from a man who'd spent 30 years in corporate finance and who measured his own daughter's worth by how much he could spend on her. And I'd felt my face burn with humiliation while my cousins had looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. Amanda had borrowed $1,500 from me in 2018, claiming she needed it for car repairs, and, when I'd asked about repayment 4 months later, she'd acted offended that I'd even brought it up, had said she thought it was a gift since we were sisters, and when I'd pressed the issue, she'd gotten Mom involved, who had asked me to just let it go for the sake of family harmony, and I'd realized then that there would never be a situation where my needs or my boundaries would be prioritized over keeping Amanda happy. All of this history, all of these accumulated wounds and disappointments, and moments when I'd almost walked away, came crashing back into sharp focus in that hospital hallway on October 14th, 2022, when my mother had been rushed to St. Vincent's Medical Center with what the doctors suspected was a stroke, and I'd driven 3 hours from Seattle the moment Amanda had called me, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way, Because whatever else was true about my complicated relationship with my mother, I loved her, and the thought of losing her terrified me in a way that transcended all the hurt and disappointment. I'd arrived at the hospital at 6:30 in the evening, had found Amanda and Richard in the waiting area outside the ICU, and the first thing Richard had said to me wasn't hello or thank you for coming, or your mother is stable, but rather, took you long enough. His tone sharp with accusation, like I'd deliberately delayed instead of breaking every speed limit to get there as fast as possible. I'd ignored the comment because this wasn't the time or place for our usual dynamic, had asked Amanda what the doctors had said, and she'd filled me in with unusual efficiency about Mom's condition, the suspected stroke, the tests they were running, the fact that she was stable, but they were keeping her for observation and wouldn't know the full extent of any damage until morning. We'd sat in that waiting room for 2 hours in tense silence, Richard scrolling through his phone, Amanda making quiet calls to various family members with updates, and me just sitting there with my hands clasped in my lap, trying not to think about worst-case scenarios. And when a nurse had finally come out to tell us that Mom was awake and asking for family, we'd all stood to go in together. That's when Richard had put his hand on my shoulder, not gently, but with pressure that felt more like restraint than comfort, and said, "Maybe you should wait here. Let Amanda and me go in first since we're the ones who've actually been around consistently, not too busy with our important careers to make time for family." And something in his tone, the casual cruelty of it, the implication that I was the one who'd been absent or neglectful when I'd driven down for visits every 6 to 8 weeks despite living 3 hours away, and despite knowing I wasn't really wanted there, made something crack inside my chest. I'd pulled away from his hand and said quietly that I had every right to see my mother, that I'd driven 3 hours to be here, and Richard's face had hardened in that way I'd seen 1,000 times before. That expression that said he was about to put me in my place, and he'd moved closer to me, crowding my space in the hallway with 2 nurses at the station nearby and an elderly couple sitting in the waiting area. And he'd said in a low voice that carried clearly in the quiet corridor, "You better start acting like you're part of this family instead of showing up when it's convenient and expecting us to welcome you with open arms. You better start showing some respect and gratitude for everything we've done for you over the years." And I'd opened my mouth to respond, though I don't know what I would have said. And that's when Richard's hand had come up fast and connected with my face. An open-palmed slap that snapped my head to the side and made my ear ring and brought instant tears to my eyes. Not just from the physical pain, though that was substantial, but from the shock and humiliation of being struck like a child in a public place. And in that moment of stunned silence that followed, I'd heard one of the nurses gasp, and I'd felt something fundamental shift inside me. A clarity settling over me like cold water, the absolute certainty that I was done, that this was the line, that I would never again subject myself to this man's cruelty or this family's dysfunction. And when I'd turned to look at Richard with my hand pressed against my burning cheek, I'd seen Amanda behind him with an expression that wasn't shock or concern, but something that looked almost like satisfaction. And I'd known with perfect certainty that I was making the right choice in what I was about to do. The 2 nurses who'd witnessed the slap moved almost simultaneously, one reaching for the phone at the nurses' station, while the other approached us with her hands slightly raised like she was trying to de-escalate a volatile situation. And she said in a firm, professional voice, "Sir, I need you to step back. We do not tolerate violence in this facility." And Richard had the audacity to look offended, to actually take a step back, with his hands up like he was the victim here, saying, "This is a family matter, a private conversation that got out of hand." But the damage was done, and the wheels were already in motion because within 2 minutes, a security guard had arrived. A tall man in his 50s with kind eyes, who positioned himself between Richard and me and asked in a calm voice if I was all right, if I needed medical attention, and I'd lowered my hand from my face, knowing that my cheek must be bright red, that the mark of Richard's hand was probably clearly visible, and I'd said quietly, "I'm fine, I just want to leave." But the nurse who'd made the call was already explaining what she'd witnessed to the security guard, and he'd turned to Richard with an expression that had gone considerably less friendly and informed him that assault was a criminal matter and that hospital policy required them to offer to contact the police. And I'd seen panic flash across Richard's face for just a second before he'd composed himself and started blustering about misunderstandings and family disagreements and how I was being dramatic. The security guard had ignored him completely and asked me directly if I wanted to file a police report, and I'd stood there in that hallway with my face throbbing and my hands shaking, and I'd looked at Richard, who was watching me with an expression that was trying to be intimidating, but I could see the fear underneath, the realization that he'd finally gone too far in a way that had witnesses and consequences. And then I'd looked past him to Amanda, who was standing there with her phone in her hand, and that same almost satisfied expression, like she was enjoying watching this unfold, like my humiliation and pain were entertaining to her. And I'd felt a cold clarity settle over me that this wasn't just about Richard, that the problem was the entire toxic system that had been built around protecting Amanda and diminishing me. And I'd surprised myself by saying, "Yes, I want to document this. I want an official record of what happened here." And I'd watched Richard's face go pale and Amanda's expression shift to something closer to alarm. And the security guard had nodded and made a call while the nurse had gently guided me to a small office off the main corridor, where she'd taken photos of my face from multiple angles and written down her account of what she'd witnessed. And she'd been so kind about it, so matter-of-fact and professional in a way that made me feel less pathetic, less like I'd somehow brought this on myself. Two police officers had arrived within 15 minutes, and I'd given my statement in that small office with the door closed, had explained the situation calmly and clearly, had provided context about the pattern of mistreatment without making it sound like I was exaggerating or being vindictive, and one of the officers, a woman probably in her early 40s, had listened with an expression of professional sympathy and had asked if I wanted to press charges, and I'd hesitated because pressing charges felt enormous, felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But then I'd thought about every Christmas and birthday and graduation where I'd been treated as less than, every time I'd swallowed my hurt and made excuses for their behavior and tried harder to earn love that was never going to be freely given. And I'd said, "I want my options documented. I want this on record, but I need time to decide about pressing charges." And the officer had nodded and said that was reasonable and that I could file charges later if I decided to, that the report and the witness statements and the photos would be sufficient, and she'd given me a card with a case number and her contact information. When I left the hospital that night, it was nearly 10 o'clock, and I drove straight back to Seattle in a state of numb focus, my hands steady on the wheel in a way they hadn't been on the drive down. And I didn't cry or rage or even really feel much of anything except a strange crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. And when I got home to my apartment, I'd sat down at my dining room table and opened my laptop and started documenting everything with the methodical precision I usually reserved for work projects. I'd uploaded the photos the nurse had taken of my face to a secure folder, had photographed my own face from additional angles because the redness was deeper now, almost purple along my cheekbone, where Richard's palm had connected hardest. And then I'd written out a detailed account of the evening while it was still fresh, including direct quotes as accurately as I could remember them, and noting the names of the two nurses who'd witnessed everything and the security guard who'd intervened and the two police officers who'd taken my statement. Then I'd done something I'd been avoiding for years, which was to go back through my text message history with my mother, with Amanda, with Richard, and I'd started taking screenshots of conversations that demonstrated the pattern of treatment I'd endured. And there were so many examples that I'd almost given up because it felt overwhelming, but I'd forced myself to be systematic about it, creating a document that organized the messages by category. Instances where family events had been planned without including me, conversations where my achievements had been dismissed or ignored, text exchanges where Amanda had asked to borrow money that was never repaid, messages from my mother making excuses for Richard's behavior, or asking me to be more understanding, or suggesting that I was being too sensitive. I'd worked until 3 in the morning compiling this record, and when I'd finally stopped, I had a document that was 23 pages long with embedded screenshots and a clear chronological pattern that showed years of systematic mistreatment. And looking at it all laid out like that had been both validating and devastating because it made undeniable what I'd been trying to minimize and excuse for so long. The next morning, I'd called Marcus Chen, a friend from college who'd gone to law school and now practiced family law in Portland, and I'd explained the situation and asked for his advice, not because I necessarily wanted to sue anyone, but because I needed to understand my options and protect myself. And Marcus had listened to the whole story and then asked me to send him the documentation I'd compiled. And after reviewing it, he'd called me back and said in his careful lawyer voice that I had grounds for a restraining order if I wanted one, that the assault combined with the documented pattern of harassment created a clear case, and that at minimum, I should have everything documented and organized in case I needed it later. Marcus had also said something that stuck with me, which was that cutting contact with toxic family members wasn't cruel or vindictive, but rather an act of self-preservation and self-respect, and that I didn't owe anyone access to my life just because we shared DNA or legal family ties. I'd spent 2 days in a state of quiet resolve, going to work and functioning normally, while internally processing the magnitude of what had happened and what I'd decided to do. And I'd blocked Richard's number and Amanda's number and changed my mother's contact settings so her calls would go straight to voicemail. And for 48 hours there was silence, which felt both peaceful and unsettling because I'd become so accustomed to their demands on my attention that the absence of it felt strange. Then on Thursday evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize with a Portland area code, and I'd answered without thinking, and my mother's voice had come through sounding weak and tearful, saying, "Sarah, honey, please don't hang up. I'm calling from Richard's colleague's phone because you blocked us." And I'd felt my stomach tighten, but I'd stayed silent and let her continue. And she'd said, "I don't understand why you're doing this. Why you're punishing me when I'm the one who was in the hospital, when I almost died." And the manipulation in that statement was so obvious that I'd actually felt angry instead of guilty. And I'd said in a voice that was calmer than I felt, "Mom, Richard assaulted me in a hospital hallway in front of witnesses. That's not something I'm going to just forget or forgive." And she'd made a sound like a sob and said, "It wasn't that bad. You're exaggerating. He barely touched you, and you know how stressed he's been with my medical situation." And I'd closed my eyes and counted to 5 before responding. "He hit me hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted a week. Hard enough that hospital security got involved and I filed a police report. That's not barely touching someone." My mother had gone quiet for a moment and then she'd shifted tactics, her voice taking on a harder edge as she said, "Well, Richard thinks you owe him an apology for making such a scene and getting the police involved, for embarrassing him like that in public." And I'd actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised me, and I'd said, "He wants an apology from me." And my mother had said, "Yes. And frankly, I think that's reasonable. You know how he is, and you could have just walked away instead of escalating things." And in that moment, something inside me had settled into a cold, certain peace, and I'd said, "I'm not apologizing. I'm not visiting. I'm not having a relationship with either of you until things change fundamentally, and I don't think that's going to happen." And before my mother could respond, I'd hung up and blocked that number too. The pressure campaign for my family continued sporadically for about 3 weeks, with calls from various numbers I didn't recognize, and a few attempts by extended family members to reach out on my mother's behalf. But I'd maintained my boundaries, and after that initial month, the contact had dwindled to almost nothing. And I'd settled into a routine in Seattle that felt surprisingly peaceful, throwing myself into my work with renewed focus and energy that I hadn't realized I'd been spending on managing family drama and emotional labor. In early November, about 6 weeks after the hospital incident, I'd been called into a meeting with Jennifer Hartwell, the VP of Digital Strategy at CloudScale Solutions, and I'd walked in thinking it might be about the Q4 campaign performance metrics. But instead, Jennifer had smiled and gestured for me to sit, and said, "Sarah, I'm going to cut right to it because I think you've seen this coming. We want to promote you to Director of Digital Marketing Strategy effective January 1st. And this comes with relocation to our San Francisco office. A salary of $175,000 plus equity and performance bonuses. I'd felt my heart jump, but I'd kept my face professional and asked about the details of the role and the expectations and the team I'd be managing. And Jennifer had walked me through everything, and it was exactly the kind of position I'd been working toward for years, the kind of role that would put me firmly in the senior leadership track. And when she'd finished, I'd said, "I accept, thank you for this opportunity." And we'd shaken hands, and I'd walked back to my desk, feeling like I was floating. The promotion came with a press release because Cloudscale was making several leadership announcements simultaneously, and they wanted to highlight their commitment to promoting from within. So in mid-November, my name and photo appeared on the company website and in a TechCrunch article about Cloudscale's executive restructuring, and the article mentioned my background and the successful campaigns I'd led, and the fact that I was one of the youngest directors in the company's history at 29. I'd posted about it on LinkedIn with a professional but genuine message about being grateful for the opportunity and excited for the challenge. And within hours, I'd gotten hundreds of congratulations from colleagues and former classmates and professional contacts, and I'd felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone, but was just pure satisfaction in my own achievement. What I hadn't expected was that someone from Portland would see it, but apparently Trevor Morrison, who'd been 2 years ahead of me in high school and now worked in tech recruiting in Portland, had come across the TechCrunch article and had posted about it on Facebook with a comment saying, "Super proud to see Sarah Mitchell from our Lincoln High class making waves in tech, killing it up in Seattle, and now heading to SF as a director." And he'd tagged the Lincoln High alumni group and several mutual friends from Portland. I didn't see this post immediately because I rarely checked Facebook anymore, but later I'd learned from a former colleague who was connected to some of my Portland circles that the post had gotten significant attention and had been shared in local Portland groups and had sparked conversations among people who apparently remembered me or knew my family. And that information had apparently made its way back to my mother and Richard and Amanda faster than I could have imagined possible. The information about my promotion and the TechCrunch article apparently reached my family the week before Thanksgiving, and I learned this because on the Tuesday before the holiday, my phone started receiving texts from numbers I didn't recognize, and when I checked them, they were screenshots of Trevor's Facebook post and the article with messages like, "Saw this about you, congrats," from people I barely remembered from high school. And I'd realized that my professional success had become public knowledge in Portland in a way I hadn't anticipated or particularly wanted. What I didn't know until later was that my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who I'd always had a decent relationship with, despite the family drama, was hosting Thanksgiving dinner that year and had invited my mother and Richard and Amanda's husband Derek, and apparently at some point during the afternoon, someone had brought up my name in the context of, "It's sad that Sarah isn't here," and Aunt Carol had mentioned seeing the article about my promotion, saying something like, "Well, she's probably very busy with her new director position in San Francisco." And according to my cousin Michelle, who told me about this weeks later, the room had gone completely silent. Michelle said that Richard had asked, "What director position?" with a tone that suggested he thought there must be some mistake, and Aunt Carol had pulled out her phone and shown everyone the TechCrunch article with my photo and the headline about Cloudscale's leadership restructuring, and Michelle said she'd watched Richard's face go red and then pale as he'd read it, and Amanda had grabbed the phone and stared at it and said, "This has to be a different Sarah Mitchell. There's no way." But Aunt Carol had said, "No, it's definitely her. Look at the photo, and it mentions she went to University of Oregon. That's our Sarah." Michelle told me that my mother had started crying, not sad tears, but something more complicated, and that she'd said, "I didn't know about any of this. She didn't tell me she was moving to San Francisco or that she'd gotten promoted." And Richard had said something dismissive like, "It's probably just an inflated job title. These tech companies do that instead of paying people real money." But Aunt Carol, who worked in HR, had said, "Richard, Director level at a company like Cloudscale is serious, and according to this article, she's one of their youngest executives. This is a really big deal. Michelle said that Amanda had been visibly upset and had made some comment about how Sarah always acts like she's better than everyone else, and how typical that she'd make a big public announcement instead of telling her own family. And Aunt Carol had apparently gotten sharp at that point and said, "From what I understand, Sarah isn't in contact with you all right now, and given what I've heard about what happened at the hospital, I can't say I blame her." And the dinner had gotten tense and awkward after that. I didn't learn about any of this until Michelle called me the following week and told me the whole story, and when she did, I'd felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness, because part of me had always wanted my family to see and acknowledge my success. But another part of me had moved past needing their validation, and hearing about their shock and Richard's attempt to diminish my achievement had actually bothered me less than I'd expected it to. What Michelle told me next was more significant, though, because she said that after Thanksgiving dinner, my mother had apparently become somewhat obsessed with finding out more about my life and career, and that she'd been asking relatives if they knew anything about what I was doing or if anyone was in contact with me. And Michelle said, "Sarah, I think your mom is realizing what she lost, what she enabled Richard to push away, and I don't know if that's going to lead to genuine change or just more manipulation. But I thought you should know they know now about your success." Michelle's warning about my family knowing turned out to be prophetic, because exactly 5 days after our conversation, I received an email from Richard's personal account, the first direct contact I'd had from him since the hospital incident 2 months earlier, and the subject line read, "We need to talk," which immediately made me tense up as I opened it in my San Francisco apartment where I'd just moved the week before. The email was surprisingly long and had clearly been written carefully, not his usual brief, dismissive communication style, and it started with, "Sarah, I want to apologize for what happened at the hospital. I was under tremendous stress with your mother's health crisis, and I acted in a way that was completely inappropriate and wrong. And I've been doing a lot of reflecting since then about our relationship and how I may have contributed to the distance between us." I read through it with a growing sense of disbelief, because the tone was so different from anything he'd ever written to me before, conciliatory and almost humble. And he went on to say, "I recently learned about your promotion and your success in your career, and I have to admit, I had no idea you had accomplished so much, and it made me realize that I haven't been paying attention to your life the way I should have been as your stepfather, and I want to do better going forward if you'll give me the chance." The email continued with specific references to my new position and even quoted from the TechCrunch article, which made it clear he'd read it carefully, and he ended with, "Your mother misses you terribly, and her health would benefit from having you back in her life. And I think we could all benefit from sitting down together and working through this as a family. Maybe you could come to Portland for Christmas, and we could start fresh in the new year." I sat staring at my laptop screen for a long time after reading it, feeling a complicated knot of emotions, because part of me, the 14-year-old girl who desperately wanted his approval, felt a flash of satisfaction that he'd finally acknowledged my achievements, but the adult I'd become could see exactly what this was. This wasn't genuine remorse or real change. This was Richard realizing that I had value he hadn't recognized, that I'd become successful in a way that reflected poorly on his dismissal of me, and possibly that I might now be in a position where I could be useful to them financially or socially. And the email's mention of my mother's health felt like emotional manipulation designed to obligate me into responding. I didn't answer the email that day or the next. Instead, I forwarded it to my therapist, who I'd started seeing after the hospital incident, and to Rachel. And Rachel had responded immediately saying, "Classic narcissist non-apology. Notice he says he acted inappropriately, but doesn't actually take responsibility for the years of treating you like garbage. And bringing up your mom's health is manipulative as hell," which articulated exactly what I'd been feeling, but hadn't quite put into words. 2 days after Richard's email, I received a text from my mother, who'd somehow gotten my new number, despite my having changed it. And the text said, "Sarah, honey, please. I saw what Richard sent you, and I'm adding my voice to his. I miss you so much, and I'm sorry for everything. You're my daughter, and I love you, and I want to be part of your life and celebrate your success with you. Please call me. That message hurt more than Richard's email had, because it came from my mother, and some part of me still craved her love and approval despite everything. But I could also see how her message worked in tandem with his, presenting a united front that was designed to break down my boundaries. And I noticed that neither of them had actually acknowledged the specific harm they'd caused or shown understanding of why I'd cut contact beyond the hospital slap. I didn't respond to either Richard's email or my mother's text, and instead I let the silence speak for itself while I continued building my life in San Francisco. And over the following months, there were periodic attempts at contact that became less frequent as time went on, including a birthday card from my mother in March that arrived at my office address, which meant someone had done research to find it, and a LinkedIn connection request from Amanda in April that I deleted without accepting, and an email from Richard in May with the subject line, Family Update, that I archived without reading. What I did, instead of engaging with their attempts to re-establish contact, was invest my energy into the life I was creating, which included leading my team through a successful product launch in January that resulted in a 32% increase in user engagement, and developing a mentorship relationship with two junior women on my team who reminded me of my younger self and who I was determined to support in ways I hadn't been supported, and building genuine friendships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. Rachel visited me in June for a long weekend, and we hiked in Muir Woods and had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the bay. And during that dinner, she'd told me, "You look different, lighter, like you've finally put down something heavy you'd been carrying." And I'd realized she was right, because I had stopped carrying the weight of seeking approval from people who were never going to give it freely. The final attempt at contact came in August, almost exactly 1 year after the hospital incident, when my mother showed up at a tech industry conference in Seattle, where I was speaking on a panel about leadership in product development, and I saw her sitting in the audience as I was answering a question about overcoming obstacles in male-dominated industries, and the sight of her there had made my heart race, but I'd finished my answer professionally and completed the panel without showing the disruption I felt. She'd waited for me afterwards near the conference hall exit, looking older and smaller than I remembered. And when I approached, she'd said, "Sarah, please just give me 5 minutes. I flew up here just to see you." And I'd agreed to talk to her in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby where the conference was being held, and she'd cried and told me that she'd left Richard 3 months earlier and was living in her own apartment in Portland and going to therapy, and that she finally understood the damage she'd allowed to happen. And part of me wanted desperately to believe her and to have my mother back in my life. But I'd learned to protect myself and to recognize that my well-being couldn't depend on her transformation. I'd told her that I was glad she was getting help and making changes, but that I needed more time before I could consider letting her back into my life, and that any future relationship we might have would look different from the past and would require consistent demonstrated change over time, not just words and promises. And she'd nodded and said she understood, and that she'd wait as long as it took, and we'd exchanged new phone numbers, but I'd made no commitment to use hers. Now it's November again, and I'm 33 years old, and my life is fully my own. And I've learned that family is something you can choose, as much as something you're born into, and that my worth was never dependent on Richard's acknowledgement, or my mother's protection, or Amanda's acceptance, and while I don't know, yet whether my mother and I will eventually rebuild some kind of relationship, I know that I'm whole and complete regardless of whether that happens. And the scared 14-year-old girl who tried so hard to earn love from people who couldn't give it has finally grown into a woman who knows her value comes from within.